Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I will be talking to Laura Crowe about her exciting new play, Vile, a new play about Lady Jane Rochford, the wife of George Boleyn. Laura is an illustrator, writer, and theatre maker from Manchester. Probably born into the wrong era, Laura spends most of her time trying to escape into the past with a love of old buildings, dusty books, and strange museums. She's had a very non-traditional route into both the arts and history, as she missed much of her education due to chronic illness. This has made her a strong advocate for the others who face barriers to pursuing their passion, and since 2017 she is running the award-winning theatre company Time and Again, who have the unique focus of exploring disability and mental health within a vibrant historical context. She has a long-standing love of the Tudors, particularly the court of Henry VIII, and since 2020, she has been researching and writing a new play about Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn. Let's get into today's episode. Hi, Laura. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hi, I am really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm Brill, thank you. I'm looking forward to today's episode. So today's a little bit different. We're talking about your play about Lady Jane Rochford, and it's called Vile, which is quite a good title for a play. In the play, you are challenging the myths surrounding Jane, because through history she's been vilified quite a bit, to say the least. Before we get onto the play and Jane, I thought, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I'm an illustrator, a writer, and a theatre maker. Um, a lot of my work is very inspired by history and books and classic literature. And it's also inspired by the fact that I'm a deaf and disabled person. So quite a lot of what I like to do is looking at disabled people's place in history and making room for them in history, because I think they're often a little bit neglected, or people maybe think that it's a more modern thing. And I'm kind of always here to advocate that, like, no, we've always been here. And yeah, recently that kind of train of thought has led me into researching and writing about Jane Rochford. That's kind of what I've been focusing on for the last 5 years now. Um, and yeah, it's just been really exciting to kind of bring all aspects of my interests together into one thing.
No, I completely agree. I think when you hear people say, no, we've never had autism until the 20th century, are you
Yeah.
okay? What was the inspiration for this play specifically?
I've wanted to write about Jane and George Boleyn and their supposedly miserable marriage for a really long time. I think, like most people, I was probably introduced to them via popular culture, so via the TV show The Tudors and the novel The Other Boleyn Girl. And their depiction in both of those, and also, I mean, most media is normally very problematic. They're not normally depicted as particularly nice characters. But these depictions kind of really compelled me to dig deeper into the real historical figures that lay behind these fictional portrayals and think about maybe what this hugely pivotal time in history might have been like from their perspective. I think women like Jane are so often just a fleeting mention or a little footnote, and they can be used by writers and TV and stories sometimes to just fulfill a role like of a villain or an antagonist. And I think I think there's something inherently other about the Rochfords, about George and Jane Boleyn, which it just kind of hugely appealed to me as a queer disabled person. But I didn't necessarily like the way this was often harnessed in fictional representations of them. So I kind of wanted to approach it myself.
No, yeah, I think Jane and George have often been put as a very disharmonious relationship, and George is sometimes portrayed quite nicely and is a bit innocent, and we have Jane is always the villain. I don't think I've seen a moderate Jane on screen, so to speak, just yet.
No, no. I genuinely can't think of a representation of Jane where I'm like, yep, that feels right. That feels fair.
When is the play set, and how much of Jane's life is covered?
So Vile is very much focused on Jane's time with the Boleyns. So it covers the period of her life from her arrival at court, which is about 1521, probably. And it goes through to the downfall of the Boleyns in 1536. So it's 15 years of her life, but at the same time, um, it's kind of sectioned off from the Catherine Howard portion of her later life because I feel like that needs to be an entire play all unto itself, that chapter of her life.
No, most definitely. I think the Catherine Howard era is often what you see most on screen, and it's just so drama filled that it
Yeah.
takes a while. How have you portrayed Jane? Have you tried to do any myth busting in the play?
Yes, absolutely. Um, I hope I hope that I'm offering a much more nuanced, well-rounded portrayal of Jane than anything we've seen before. I think especially as we're following her story and exploring how these big events and these decisions of the 1520s, 1530s might have affected her life. But at the same time, I also didn't want to sort of tip into making her this angelic, ultra capable, good at everything Mary Sue type character that I think sometimes crops up fairly frequently these days with female characters in modern period dramas. It felt important to give her agency and approach this version of her character with empathy, but at the same time to still give her some pretty big flaws because everyone makes questionable decisions at some point in their lives. And I think it's really important that we don't hold historical figures to like a good bad dichotomy. They were real people navigating hugely turbulent and traumatic events. And I think they were just trying to do as best they could at the time.
No, I completely agree. I think you see a lot in, as you were saying, you've seen a lot in TV now or and biographies that either Anne Boleyn is either a victim or a vixen. Same with Catherine Howard.
Yeah.
And I think we forget that these people were living in a very stressful place.
Yeah.
And if you didn't do a murky thing or two in the Tudor court, I would be hugely surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you pointed out, like with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, it is interesting how it always seems to be women that are sort of held to this higher standard as well, this higher standard of morality.
Yeah, we have a look at the women and we don't go, why aren't we questioning Henry VIII and his motives or Charles Brandon and his motives? And it's a
Yeah,
whole hornet's nest.
yeah, absolutely.
So who's in the play and where is the play set? Are you at the Tower, Hampton Court, that kind of thing?
So, in terms of real historical figures, we obviously have quite a few of the Boleyn family. So we have Jane Parker, who becomes Jane Boleyn, and her husband George Boleyn. And sort of throughout the play, they become Lord and Lady Rochford as George is elevated. And then we also have Queen Anne Boleyn, who's George's sister, and Thomas Boleyn, who is George's father. And then stepping away from the Boleyns, we have Thomas Wyatt and Francis Bryan, who were both courtiers during the reign of Henry VIII. And they're just two figures that I'm really fascinated by. I don't know why there hasn't been more TV or film portrayals of them because you could honestly just fill a whole movie with the events of either of their lives. They so interesting. And I think again they're often maybe a bit pushed to the side or they're kind of there in the background of other people's stories. But yeah, hopefully I've been able to dive into their lives a little bit more. And then the final two characters in the play are we have two completely fictional characters, ladies in waiting, and they're both called Mary because I feel like everyone had one of about three names in the 16th century, and I kind of wanted to acknowledge that a little bit.
How do you want Jane to come across in the play? Obviously, you said you want her to be more nuanced, but how do you want kind of the audience and viewers to see her?
Yeah. Um, so I'd love for Jane to come across as a real person, rather than a bit of a cardboard cutout stock character. I think like we both touched on a bit, she's often kind of relegated to just being the villain or just being like the bitter wife in portrayals. Um, I think when Lady Rochford's name is mentioned, like in discussions, like comment threads on social media or YouTube, there's still a bit of a knee-jerk reaction when her name's mentioned. A lot of repeating 17th, 18th century accusations that had kind of grew up around her, like mythologized her as this sort of bitter, vindictive, sneaky betrayer when really I think she was probably just desperately trying to survive, like almost everyone in that time. And whilst I think she did probably make quite a few mistakes along the way, like I said, everything with Catherine Howard would need to be unpicked in a whole other play. That is one aspect of her life where I'm still like, I cannot understand what was going through your mind. But I think her supposed role in the downfall of Anne and George is unfair and not really backed by any evidence and just hugely exaggerated. It's just grown up over the years. I think Jane is someone that we look at retroactively because of how we know her life ended. And hopefully this play can fill in those previous years of her life a bit and give a more rounded look of her time at court and her marriage, instead of just kind of throwing her in at the end of a series or novel where everything's already gone wrong and she's already kind of in the depths of, yeah, the chaos.
Yeah, I think people forget that Jane was at court for a long time before Anne joined the English court, especially. I think Jane joined us say in the 1520s, early 1520s. So she was
Yeah.
there a long time.
Yeah, there's mention of her being at the Field of the Cloth of Gold with her parents, and so maybe she then joined court immediately after that, or maybe a bit after. But yeah, she definitely was there before Anne, and she managed to stay there for a long time. She served five of Henry's queens, so she definitely was a survivor, and she obviously was good at being a courtier because she kind of clung on. She clung on for a long time when others didn't.
How did you? I obviously can't don't want to spoil the play, but regarding the Anne Boleyn downfall in 1536,
Mhm.
how did you try and look at the source evidence for that? Because obviously it's very few and far between in Jane's involvement in that time.
Yeah. Um, I think it's interesting though, given how, like, obviously Jane isn't a member of the royal family. I mean, sort of tangentially, obviously she was sister-in-law of Anne, but she wasn't a member of the core royal family. And obviously she was a woman, but she does just crop up fairly frequently in sort of source material, given how much of a sort of, yeah, smaller part of the court she played. So I think obviously looking at first-hand accounts are so useful. So any of the dispatches from Eustace Chapuis, he mentions her a reasonable few times. He mentioned about her exile from court, which happened in the autumn of 1534, which is quite interesting. Um, Looking at records from uh, Jane and from Anne and George's trials, which is obviously where we get this mention of one woman more that might have given evidence. I mean, Jane's never mentioned by name in the trials, apart from again a written account from Chapuis that says that Anne and Jane talked about Henry VIII's sexual prowess. But that wasn't in the trial. That was obviously before the trial, possibly something she said to Cromwell. We just don't know. But that's the only mention of her around that time. There's definitely no written evidence that she instigated the incest allegations, as quite a lot of fictional depictions show, or that she went to Cromwell, that she willingly gave evidence. There's nothing really to suggest that. Um, on the other hand, we do have evidence that she was going to try and petition the king on George's behalf, and she wrote to George when he'd been arrested. So, yeah, it's interesting picking through that and sort of seeing what's actually there and what's kind of then built up as myth since then.
Yeah, I think that obviously what we do have around, especially 1536, that Jane's actually worried about her husband and is a bit, is concerned about what's going to happen because why would it benefit Jane for her to lose her husband and her position?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Like up until that time, Jane and George had kind of they'd just been on the up. They'd just been gaining more power, more wealth, more influence. I mean, obviously hers is directly through him because at that time everything she had was his. But it would not benefit her at all for George to be brought down. The settlement of her jointure was considerably like very, very small compared to the life she'd been accustomed to living. And in the event, she then even had to get Thomas Cromwell to intercede with Thomas Boleyn because he didn't want to pay out everything that she was owed. So yeah, it definitely was, yeah, changed her life completely and not to the better, I think.
A big assumption about Jane and George is that they didn't have a happy marriage because there are no children.
Mhm.
Obviously we don't have a lot enough about their marriage to like say whether it's happy or bad. But I don't think a lack of children should be a big basis for why they didn't get on, particularly. I think it's quite a weak argument, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think this is something that is definitely I've explored quite a lot in the play. It's, I think to a certain extent, it's one of those assumptions that still exists a little bit to this day of the expected path of a marriage and the assumption that couples will have children. And obviously that was much more heightened in the 16th century. But yeah, we don't know why they didn't have children. We just don't know. Maybe they couldn't, maybe they didn't want to. Um, and I think that is the only piece of evidence as to why their marriage was not happy is, yeah, like you said, quite weak. There's evidence that when George was away on embassy in France, that Jane regularly wrote to him, which suggests that there was, I don't know, maybe not intimacy between them. It might have been, but like definitely that their marriage was like a functioning kind of arrangement where they kept each other up to date with what was going on. And like I said, she offered to intercede with Henry VIII when he was arrested. And she did also wear black for the rest of her life after he was killed, which I don't know what that might suggest. We know prior to George's execution that her wardrobe contained clothes of quite a lot of different colours, stockings of different colours. But yeah, the latter part of her life after his execution, she only wore black, really.
I mean, I think that's interesting because I think that for me is a bit of an indication about maybe what she felt towards George. I mean, as you say, like it might have not have been a romantic relationship, but it could have been a partnership,
Yeah.
especially.
I think so. I think that's definitely the conclusion I've come to within my fictional world of them. I think they must have had a strong partnership because they were married for a long time, about 12 years. We don't know exactly what date that they were married, but based on when her jointure was signed, and then a letter from Cardinal Wolsey saying that he's giving George an extra £20 a year because now he's married, can place their wedding to around about the end of 1524 or the first half of 1525. So yeah, they were married for about 12, 11 or 12 years.
Obviously, Jane's mental health when she's arrested in Catherine Howard's queenship, it like deteriorates and she has a mental breakdown. Do you portray Jane's mental health from the beginning of the play? Because obviously it can't have been a sudden thing, her mental health.
Yeah, this is something I found really interesting when I started digging into Jane's life, is that ideas of mental health, invisible disability, or insanity, to use this 16th century terminology that they would use at the time, like they really surround Jane. There was a 2016 paper by the Tudor Society looking into the Parker family monument at the church near the home where Jane grew up in Great Hallingbury. And the research into that found that Jane's grandfather suffered bouts of insanity, and it also suggested that her father, Lord Morley, might have had a disability or a chronic illness because he never did any military service at all, which was highly unusual for a 16th century noble at that time. Um, and then Jane is further linked to this idea of mental health through the idea that George was actually the governor of Bethlehem Hospital, which became known as Bedlam and has kind of become a bit of a byword for insane asylums, mental health hospitals. Like it's probably the most famous example we have, and I found it really interesting that George was actually the governor of that hospital in the 1530s. Sort of suggested to me, I wonder if they ever visited as a couple as part of their duties. I wonder if they ever had to visit at any point. Um, but yeah, Jane's mental breakdown when she was arrested alongside Catherine Howard is obviously a particularly notable link to mental health, mental illness. And I suppose, like I said, how people retroactively look at Jane's life, I kind of took this as a bit of a starting point and worked backwards because, like you said, it kind of suggested to me that she might have always have lived with a mental illness or a mental condition. Like, whilst we have evidence that other prisoners understandably suffered with anxiety and depression and even made suicide attempts while they were in the Tower, I think the fact that Jane was actually removed from the Tower of London and taken to the Russell House to be nursed back to health suggests that her breakdown was severe or an extreme display of mental illness that was beyond the normal of what they expected in that situation. Um, I have OCD myself, and I was diagnosed when I was a teenager. And I know that periods of great change or stress or major world events, they can all really exacerbate it. And thinking about someone in the 16th century, this point of history, the 1520s, the 1530s, everything was constantly shifting. There was such change at this time. There was this ever present threat of things like the sweating sickness or the plague. There was this huge religious upheaval that I think we can't quite comprehend from a 21st century perspective, but that was literally uprooting the entire understanding and basis of people's lives. And I wanted to explore what it would be like to try and navigate all of this if you were also contending with something like OCD or a mental health condition, which obviously wouldn't have had a name or a diagnosis at that time. You couldn't have got any help or any support for it. You'd have just had to try and suppress it, try and keep it hidden. And if you were in a hugely public facing position like Jane as the Queen's sister-in-law or lady in waiting at the royal court, it must have been such a huge weight to carry. And whilst there's no direct evidence, obviously, that Jane had OCD because it didn't even have a name back then, there wasn't really a concept for it. Obviously, people have had a huge variety of mental conditions for as long as there have been people. And that can sometimes get lost, I think, in portrayals of history, like invisible disability, chronic illness. It's not a new thing. We've always been there.
No, yeah, I think obviously the law was changed because Jane was declared insane.
Yeah.
And well, Henry VIII, as generous as he was, changed the law for her because he's
Mhm.
a good fellow like that.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think you see, especially in the Tower, as you were saying, like mental health is such a big thing. Obviously, we have Edward Earl of Warwick was imprisoned when he was like 10 or 11, and it clearly had a lot of damage on his mental health because they say that he's a bit slow, and that's how they phrased it. And so obviously, it was probably a terrifying place, even though it was still a royal palace. It
Yeah.
must have been if you were a prisoner, you didn't know if you were going back out or if you're
Yeah.
going to go out and like, walk out happily or you'd walk to the block. And I think that can probably put so much stress on someone. It's not a surprise it causes a breakdown, in all honesty.
Yeah, like there's evidence, isn't there, with Anne Boleyn's own imprisonment that her behaviour became very erratic once she was in the tower. She sort of, her moods shifted from being like very contemplative, like in prayer, to being talking a lot, saying a lot, trying to work out what was going on, this sort of black humor. Like, yeah. But I think there must have been something beyond what they would have expected with Jane for them to actually remove her from the tower, I think. I think it's a shame that there isn't more source evidence about what went on. We just have this description that she fell into fits of frenzy. But yeah.
Another big assumption about, well, more about George, but how it affects George and Jane is that he was possibly gay, and
Mhm.
that's why their marriage wasn't happy. Do you address this at all in the play?
Yes. So yeah, this is something we explore quite deeply in the play. I think alongside what I was saying about disability often getting erased from history, I also think LGBT identities are something else that's often re maybe erased from history or not presented in a very positive light. I think they can often be used to sensationalize stories. As you said, with Jane and George's marriage, this theory around George's sexuality is often given as a reason for why they might have been unhappy. I think so. George is one of those rare examples of a man from English history who's actually largely defined by the women in his life. So his actions and his position is often defined by his sisters, Mary and Anne, as well as his relationship with his wife. And I think that, along with the fact that Jane and George never had children, really feeds into this idea of otherness, particularly sexual otherness that surrounds the couple. The idea, the sort of the theory that George might have been gay was first suggested in the 1980s by a historian called Reva Warnick. And it kind of has really taken root, I guess, in the popular imagination since then. It was obviously uh, a theory used by Philippa Gregory in The Other Boleyn Girl. It was also used in The Tudors, and I have to say, I really don't like the depiction of George in The Tudors. Um, but there's actually scant evidence that this was historically the case. Um, but yeah, I think the idea that George was possibly gay or bisexual is used in fiction quite a lot to show him as devious or malicious or promiscuous, and a valid reason for Jane to be horrified by him. And I find that quite problematic. I recently listened to an episode of Talking Tudors that had the historian Jack Beasley talking about sexuality in early modern England. And I think he made a point that historians often, unfortunately, feel the need to defend George from these accusations of being gay, as though his achievements or reputation as a courtier will somehow be diminished if he had had same-sex relationships. So I think it's something I really wanted to do was to include this idea that he might have had a different sexuality, but present it in a positive and empowering way, and potentially something that could have actually helped Jane and George connect with each other in our version of the story, rather than it being a sort of scandalous, sensationalizing sort of element that sort of drove them apart. Because I think people, a bit like I was saying, with disability, LGBT people have lived throughout history. Obviously, the way people understood those identities or societal expectations meant that they couldn't always live openly or in a way we might today. But obviously, they still had fulfilling, successful lives and different sorts of marriages. And I think it's just interesting to dig into that in a bit more of a positive way than perhaps has been shown up until now.
I'm going to put you on the spot here. What is unique about this play and what makes it stand out?
Okay. So I think when we were approaching how we were actually going to make this as a piece of theatre, um, something that was really important to us, given the sort of themes we're trying to address in the play, is that the play could be accessed by as many people as possible. So we tried to build creatively integrated access into the play. So what I mean by that is the whole play is captioned, but it's captioned in a way that it's built into the design of the world. So we have illustrations and projections throughout the show in the style of 16th century woodcuts. And so the words the characters are saying are also captioned in that sort of style and the way it's placed on the set. So sometimes when you go to the theatre and it is captioned, there'll just be like a little screen up to the side or at the bottom that just sort of has them in a like a very standard font, and it's not really integrated into the world. Whereas we wanted to build it into the design of the show so that people that use those captions can, stay focused on what the actors are doing and have it kind of built into the whole world. In the same line, we've also built in integrated audio description. So that's for blind or visually impaired audience members. So the script of the show should kind of have all the information you need in it if you were watching it without sight. And the soundscapes and the music should be telling a rich story in the same way that the captions and the projections are telling a very visual story. Um, and the work we've done on this access has been very led by people with that lived experience. The cast and creative team is a majority disabled and queer led team, and we're hoping we've kind of used people's lived experience and harness their ideas and thoughts to try and make the show accessible for everyone.
If you had to describe your play in one sentence to someone, what would that sentence be?
Hmm. Okay, so I'd probably say Vile is a rude and radical re-evaluation of Anne Boleyn's infamous sister-in-law, Lady Rochford, celebrating queer and disabled identities in an era when neither were recognised.
What does this play mean to you personally?
It feels really important, actually. Like I said, I've been working on it for nearly 5 years now in some form or another. So I feel like I've been sitting down with Jane and George Boleyn for quite a long time now. And I think particularly at this point in where we're up to with the world as well, it's kind of started to feel increasingly vital to me as a writer that I'm trying to reclaim a version of Jane and George's narratives, just as right now in the 21st century, quite a lot of people are kind of needing to reclaim their own space and fight for their rights. I think like why should the suggestion that Jane or George might have had a different sexual identity or a mental health condition mean that their marriage couldn't have been a happy, successful one or a non-traditional one maybe? I wanted to use these facets of their story not to sensationalize or villainize them as some other forms of media have done before, but to really humanize and empower them. And in doing so, hopefully empower queer, disabled audience members who rarely get to see themselves positively reflected in historical stories.
Where can people follow updates about the play and learn more about it?
So you can follow Vile on Instagram and TikTok, and we're at Vile underscore the Tudor play. You can also follow Time and Again Theatre Company, who's that's my theatre company, and that's who's producing Vile, which is at Time and Again TC. Um, and if you like historical and book inspired illustrations, you can follow me, and I'm at It's Laura Crow. And I also have a website with the same address where I sell quite a few Tudor things alongside classic literature bits and pieces.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
I feel like I've definitely talked about this throughout the podcast, and it's probably maybe more than a pet peeve, but very much in line with everything I'm saying. I do dislike it when people pretend that LGBT or queer people or disabled people didn't exist in the past and that they didn't have fulfilling, joyous, messy, thriving lives, or that it's somehow inaccurate if they're included in historical dramas or depictions. So yeah, I think that's probably my biggest pet peeve.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
This is really difficult because there's so many. And I feel like I would want to, and I feel like I would want to choose an event where quite a lot of the people that I'd like to see what they were like were actually present. And obviously, my brain is very, very Tudor focused at the moment. So I think probably the coronation of Anne Boleyn, maybe specifically the big banquet afterwards. Although, yeah, George Boleyn wasn't there, and I would definitely like to know what he was like. But a non-Tudor event, I think I would have to say VE Day 1945 in London, just being in amongst the celebrations for that, I think as well would be quite a moment.
Have you got a favourite historical book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
So this is probably quite a route one answer, but I'm gonna have to say the Wolf Hall trilogy by Hilary Mantel. They're just, I think, the most incredible depiction of that point in history, like the world building, the way she creates this world from Thomas Cromwell's perspective. It feels like you're there. Um, yeah, I've read them a few times, even though they're such big books. I've read them a few times, and I definitely think they're books that I'll revisit over the years. But if I was going to pick a non-fiction book, and again a non-Tudor book, it would probably be The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, because I think that's a really incredible book and makes you sort of revise and maybe reclaim a lot of space around the whole Jack the Ripper um, myth and refocus on the victims.
But I mean, four fantastic choices there. I mean, the Wolf Hall trilogy, oh my God, is spectacular.
Yeah.
I mean, I've read them a few times and they are lengthy, you do need to sit down with it.
It's a commitment, isn't it? It's a commitment.
Have you watched both series yet?
I have, yeah, I have. Yeah, I just finished rereading Mirror and the Light when it came onto the television. So I don't know if that was a good thing or not because it was very fresh in my mind. It made me be like, oh, they've not put this bit in or they've not put that bit in. But I think it's so difficult, isn't it, when they've only got such a finite amount of time. And I think they do a really great job of kind of condensing those massive books into sort of hour-long episodes.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Again, this is so difficult. I feel like this is the kind of thing I could talk about for so long. Obviously, Jane and George Boleyn are kind of top of my list at the moment because they're at the forefront of my mind, and I feel like I've kind of been occupying their lives a bit. But other Tudors would probably be Anne Boleyn or Thomas Wyatt or Thomas Cromwell. I think they'd be very interesting dinner party guests. But maybe if I could only pick one historical figure, I probably have to say William Shakespeare, I think.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, Williams wrote some of the greatest plays in the world, so
Yeah, be so interesting to see. I mean, maybe it wouldn't, maybe it'd be hugely disappointing, but interesting to see where all of that came from. Like, what was the actual person like?
and finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
I I don't even know what my favorite historical fact would be. But like I'm gonna have to just say like a really flippant one or something that I've kind of been incorporating into the play. What's maybe something that's gone into the play? Um, an old 16th century sort of country remedy for when you had period pain was to put a dead toad on your stomach. Maybe that.
That's certainly a unique fact.
Yeah, maybe that's my interesting fact.
I'd like to know how that worked in them days.
Yeah, I feel like they didn't go into like a sort of user guide for it.
Just put dead frog on you and you'll figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it specified how successful people actually found it either.
Thank you so much for coming on today, and I can't wait to see your play either.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so good to talk to you and get a chance to talk about the play, and just any chance to sort of talk about the Tudors is obviously, yeah, I will always take it.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.